I always knew my son had a special connection with animals. He would spend hours outside, crouched in the grass, watching ants march along the sidewalk, rescuing worms after a rainstorm, and whispering to stray cats as if they shared a language I couldn't hear. He was gentle, careful, and impossibly patient, a trait rare in an 8-year-old. So when he came to me one evening, shifting uncomfortably on his feet, hands gripping the hem of his shirt, and whispered, "Mom, I feel weird, down there," I assumed the worst. Worms. Kids get them all the time, right? Maybe from playing in the dirt too much, or forgetting to wash his hands before eating. I tried not to make a big deal out of it, keeping my voice calm as I told him we'd visit the doctor tomorrow. That night, he lay curled up on the couch instead of his bed, watching his favorite nature documentary, but I noticed he barely paid attention. He kept shifting, wincing now and then, as if something inside him was stirring. By morning, his discomfort had turned into pain. At the clinic, I held his small hand in mine, squeezing it gently while the doctor asked the usual questions. The exam was quick but thorough, and I braced myself for a lecture about hygiene, a prescription, maybe even a few embarrassed laughs at my paranoia. But when the doctor straightened up, frowning at the chart in his hands, I felt the first real sliver of fear. "We need to run some tests," he said. That was the moment everything changed. The test results came back quickly, faster than I had expected. I sat in the sterile white room, my son swinging his legs from the examination table, his face pale, drawn with discomfort. I told myself it was just worms. That's all it could be. A common parasite, something easily treatable. But when the doctor returned, I noticed the change in his demeanor. The way his fingers fidgeted against the clipboard. The way he avoided looking directly at me. I had expected a simple prescription, maybe a mild scolding about making sure my son washed his hands better. Instead, he hesitated before speaking, his eyes darting toward my son, as if debating whether to speak in front of him at all. Worms, yes. But not like anything they had seen before. The stool sample had been riddled with them, so much so that the lab had assumed an error in their testing. They had tested again. And again. What they found didn't match any known species. They were unlike any parasites typically found in humans. They were longer, thinner, with segmented bodies that pulsed unnaturally under the microscope, reacting aggressively to their environment. Worse, they weren't behaving as expected. Normal intestinal worms are sluggish, barely moving outside their host. These were different. When exposed to air, they coiled and thrashed violently. When subjected to the usual antiparasitic treatments, medications designed to kill even the most resilient species, these things did not die. They didn't even slow down. They resisted. Even more unsettling, they seemed aware. That was the word the doctor had used. Awareness. As if these things could sense what was being done to them. As if they understood. A lump formed in my throat, a sick, coiling fear that I tried to suppress. Parasites shouldn't behave like that. But there was something else. Something worse. When they had examined my son's ultrasound, looking for the primary site of infestation, they found movement. Not just in his intestines, but deeper. Higher. Closer to his organs. These things weren't just living inside his digestive system. They were spreading. I clenched my fists, forcing myself to stay calm, to hold my son's hand as he fidgeted, unaware of what was happening inside him. He was still just a child. He shouldn't have to know. But I knew. I knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. They started the treatment immediately. The doctors weren't sure what these things were, but they knew they had to act fast. My son was given the strongest deworming medication available, something reserved for severe parasitic infections, the kind found deep in the jungles of foreign countries, not in an 8-year-old boy from a suburban neighborhood. As a precaution, they gave me a dose too. The doctor reassured me it was just in case, that it was standard protocol for anyone in close contact with an infected patient. I nodded along, but inside, I wasn't convinced. If the usual treatments weren't working, what made them think this one would? I watched my son closely over the next few days, expecting improvement. The medication should have killed whatever was inside him. But each morning, instead of looking better, he seemed worse. His skin, once a healthy pink, had turned dull and pale. His eyes had lost their usual brightness, sunken slightly into his face as if sleep no longer gave him rest. His energy dwindled. The boy who once ran through the yard chasing birds now struggled to lift his head from the pillow. He barely ate. When he did, he would grimace, pressing a hand to his stomach, wincing as if something inside him was moving. And then, just when I thought it couldn't get worse, the dog died. He had been my son's best friend since he was a toddler, a gentle old Labrador who followed him everywhere. The dog had always been healthy, never a single issue beyond the stiffness in his joints that came with age. But one morning, he was just gone. No warning, no signs of sickness. Just lying in his usual spot near my son's bed, his body unnaturally still, his belly oddly distended. I knelt beside him, running my hands through his fur, feeling the stiffness that told me he had been dead for hours. I wanted to believe it was a coincidence. That maybe old age had finally caught up to him. But something about it didn't feel right. The vet had no real answers. They performed a basic exam, but there was nothing obvious, no poisoning, no trauma. It was as if something inside him had simply stopped working. Or worse, had been taken from him. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw my son, his frail little body curled up under his blankets, his breath shallow. I saw the dog lying lifeless beside him, his once bright eyes dull and empty. And then I felt it. A slow, crawling itch. Deep inside me. At first, I told myself it was nothing. Just paranoia. I had taken the medication, after all. I was fine. But as I lay there in the dark, I couldn't shake the sensation. It wasn't on the surface of my skin, not something I could scratch away. It was inside. A subtle, shifting movement. A terrible, growing awareness. I clutched my stomach, forcing myself to breathe evenly, telling myself it was just stress, exhaustion, anything but what I knew, deep down, was happening. I wasn't fine. I wasn't fine at all. The morning after the hospital visit, I woke with a strange sense of relief. My body felt lighter, and the deep, gnawing itch inside me had faded. My son was still asleep, his breathing slow and steady. For the first time in days, I let myself believe it was over. The medication had worked. I forced myself to relax, shaking off the paranoia that had crept into my thoughts over the past week. The dog's death had been tragic, but unrelated, I told myself. My son's exhaustion. A side effect of the treatment, nothing more. The past few days had been a storm of fear, but now, finally, it was clearing. I made breakfast, sitting at the kitchen table with a steaming cup of coffee, daring to let my mind drift toward normal things, chores, work, anything but sickness and death. Then I glanced toward my son, still half asleep on the couch, and my breath caught in my throat. His eyes were open. But something was wrong. At first, I couldn't place it. The expression on his face was vacant, unnerving. His pupils were slightly dilated, his gaze unfocused, as if he were looking through me rather than at me. But that wasn't what made my stomach turn. Something inside his right eye was moving. I froze, my coffee forgotten in my trembling hands. A small, pale shape wriggled just beneath the surface of his cornea. It slid along the lower edge of his iris before disappearing into the darkness of his pupil, vanishing like a worm burrowing into soft earth. I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. Then the phone rang. It was the veterinary clinic. The woman on the other end of the line sounded breathless, frantic. At first, They had found nothing unusual in my dog's remains. But then, hours later, something had changed. The parasites had grown. Multiplied. At an alarming rate. They had spread through the body faster than anything the vets had ever seen, erupting into thousands of tiny, writhing forms. By morning, they had been everywhere. It wasn't just my dog. Other dogs on the street had started dying. Sudden, unexplained deaths. And when their bodies were examined, the same thing was found. Worms. Thousands of them. The infection was spreading. My breath came in shallow gasps. I turned back to my son, my hands trembling as I reached for him. He was still staring, still unmoving, his skin pale and waxy. Something deep inside me twisted with a primal, overwhelming fear. They weren't normal parasites. They weren't supposed to act like this. The doctors had tested my son's blood, but they had missed something. Something fundamental. Something wrong. A mutation. Later, I would learn the truth. My son carried a genetic anomaly, a rare sequence in his DNA that somehow altered the biological development of common parasites. What had once been harmless, treatable worms had changed inside him, transforming into something else. Something aggressive. Something self-sustaining. Something that could spread. By the time I realized what was happening, it was too late. That evening, my son collapsed. His body seized violently, foam bubbling at the corners of his lips. His limbs jerked unnaturally, as if something inside him was controlling the movements. I tried to hold him, to comfort him, but the second I touched his skin, I felt it. The movement. Beneath the surface. Thousands of them. The hospital could do nothing. The parasites had consumed him from the inside out, taking over his nervous system, shutting down his organs. The blankness in his eyes remained even in death. By morning, his body was still. The boy who loved animals. The boy who whispered to birds. Gone. I was too numb to cry. And then, the itching inside me started again. This time, it didn't stop. By morning, I knew it was over. The sensation inside me had changed. Before, it had been an itch, a shifting discomfort just beneath my skin. But now, it was movement, undeniable, grotesque. A sickening slither that coiled through my gut, spiraled up my spine, wound itself deeper into my flesh like roots taking hold in damp earth. I could feel them. Everywhere. My son's body remained where I left it, tucked beneath his blankets, frozen in that unnatural stillness. But he was not alone. They had begun to emerge. The same pale, writhing things I had seen in his eye were now spilling from his mouth, from his nose, from the soft skin of his arms where they had burrowed outward in desperate, instinctual escape. They swarmed over his sheets, spilling onto the floor, squirming in thick, pulsing masses. I stepped back, my stomach lurching, my throat locking against a scream that refused to come. I had no time to grieve. Beyond my walls, the world was changing. The outbreak had spread. The first signs had started in my neighborhood, neighbors complaining of stomach pains, strange rashes forming along their arms and legs. Then, in the early hours of the morning, the deaths began. First the dogs, then the people. One by one, collapsing in their homes, in their cars, in the streets, their bodies left to be claimed by the infestation within. I watched through my window as hazmat teams arrived, their suits white and pristine against the backdrop of rot. The city was being cut off. A full quarantine. Blockades formed at every highway leading out, barricades erected at every back road and side street. No one left. No one entered. It was as if we were already dead. A city-sized corpse, waiting to rot. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to hope. Maybe they could contain it. Maybe the horrors breeding beneath our feet wouldn't escape the perimeter. Maybe the world outside would never have to see what had happened here. But then I noticed the birds. They gathered in droves, circling overhead, perching along telephone wires, their beady black eyes watching from rooftops and fences. They were the only things left alive. The only things untouched. And they were feeding. I watched as crows landed on the lifeless bodies strewn across the pavement. Peeling away flesh, snapping up writhing, half-born things that spilled from open wounds. Swallowing them whole. And then, as if satisfied, they took flight. South. North. East. West. Carrying the end with them. No one had accounted for that. I sank to my knees, my hands clutching my stomach as I felt the weight inside me shift, the parasites writhing in thick, ceaseless waves beneath my ribs. There was nothing left to do. No cure. No escape. I was breaking apart from the inside. I stumbled to the mirror, gripping the edge of the sink as the last of my strength drained from my limbs. My skin was gray, hollow, my lips cracked and dry. My body no longer felt like my own. And then I saw it. In my reflection. A slow, twisting movement beneath the thin flesh of my eye. A larva. Sliding lazily across the white of my sclera, curling around the dark center of my pupil before disappearing somewhere deeper. I let out a trembling breath. The last thing I would ever see would be them. And then, all at once, the writhing beneath my skin stopped. Darkness swallowed me whole. And I felt nothing at all. Thanks for watching. If you liked the story, click like, subscribe to the channel, and write an idea for the next story in the comments.